We know that the GPU market has been interesting over the past 12 months or so, but if you can't get your hands on a GPU, no problem, because AMD have you covered with their range of APUs known as Cezanne. These are Zen 3 powered and offer an awful lot of processing grunt, but have the benefit of a built-in GPU. I'd like to thank both CyberPower and AMD for sponsoring this video for me to have a look at the Ryzen 5600G here. Now, the great thing about Cezanne is that you still have a lot of flexibility for your upgrades, and we'll be actually testing this system with an AMD Radeon RX 6800 XT later on. But first of all, let's have a quick look at the system itself, the specifications, and how everything comes together. Our machine then is a Ryzen 5600G, which is a 6-core 12-thread processor, enough threads for modern gaming, and should do a great job for those dipping their toes into creativity such as video editing or 3D rendering. We'll take a look at benchmarks later, of course. The CPU is backed up with 16GB of DDR4 memory running at a fairly nippy 3600 MHz, and an MSI B550A Pro ties everything together. Fortunately, CyberPower have outfitted the system with a 650-watt high-quality PSU with the necessary PCIe cables for our high-end graphics card testing later. SSD duties are carried out with an NVMe Seagate Fire CUDA 530 with a terabyte of capacity designed around the PCIe 4 interface. It goes without saying that the board too has great upgrade options. There are 4 DDR4 memory slots if you want to increase capacity and keep the same memory that's already in there. Don't worry though, we do have 2 slots already filled, so you do get dual channel memory here. A good smattering of PCIe ports, and the bottommost slot though is pulling wireless communication duties. Build quality of the system is pretty excellent. CyberPower have done a pretty great job with cable management around the rear of the system. There are lots of fan connectors dotted around both the rear on the fan controller as well as the motherboard itself. This allows you to add more fans or tweak things as necessary. The system does also come with an AMD stock cooler, which does a fair job at handling the CPU under load, but because this is a 500 series board, should your needs change, you could grab even say a 5950X with 16 cores, 32 threads, and then just change things around as needed. Yeah, I would recommend a beefier cooler though, because 16 cores is an awful lot of power. Overall, the system is quiet under heavy load, such as our Blender benchmarks. Of course, dedicated GPUs often put out the most noise in modern dedicated rigs. Our system is also preloaded with Windows 11, and all of the relevant updates and drivers were all installed, good to go. Outside of the GPU and CPU upgrade path, there's also another NVMe slot, the usual smattering of SATA ports, and of course, as I mentioned, you can also upgrade the memory and other things too. Quick note about our testing. I've left this system at default, so I haven't tweaked the BIOS or anything else, because I figure that's how most individuals are going to be experiencing the PC. However, of course, you are free to go into MSI's BIOS and play around with things and so on, but just for this video, I haven't done any tweaking. With that said though, if you are interested in me tweaking Cezanne, maybe I'll make a video of it. Let me know down in the comments below. So then, gaming performance. Counter-Strike is perhaps one of the most popular titles out there. The Zen 3 based Cezanne architecture can easily tear through games with its CPU grunt. GPU performance here though, with the built-in GPU, does offer enough performance for high refresh rate 1080p, and I suspect that this will be the target resolution many of you will want to pair with such a system. But more demanding gaming workloads such as Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, is quite comfortable at 1080p, especially if you're willing to use AMD's awesome FSR technology to upscale. If you don't want to use FSR, then you may need to crank the quality settings down a little bit, but yeah, FSR does a pretty good job here. Similarly, you could say almost identical things for Resident Evil Village. It's very playable, and users can opt for higher in-game quality settings if FSR is employed, but naturally this does depend on your personal preferences. Productivity and general benchmarks have decided to throw a mixture of things like Cinebench, Blender, SpecViewPerf and other tests into the fray. In applications like Cinebench though, we can clearly see the major performance gains that Zen 3 has had in terms of single-thread performance over its predecessors, especially Zen 1. In other applications like SpecViewPerf and Blender, the Ryzen 5600G does perform admirably. With 6 cores, 12 threads, it does have enough grunt for those dipping their toes into, say, Blender, but really the AM5 platform does have the ability to drop in higher core count and more powerful CPUs in the future. So if, for example, you start to get really serious with Blender, perhaps you could drop in a Ryzen Vega CPU when AMD launches them next year. I'd like to disclose that the MSI Radeon RX 6800 XT here we're using was not sent by AMD. It's actually been purchased by us on the channel, and of course all of your support has made this possible. We were given a reference card by AMD for testing several months ago, but we sent it back when we got hold of one of our own GPUs, because I did want an RDNA 2 card on the channel because, well, it's good to have. Of course, plonking in the Radeon RX 6800 XT is pretty easy. Essentially, you just throw it into a PCIe slot. I definitely took the time to plonk in the retention screws, actually I did, and you of course just feed the PCIe cable through. The 6800 XT though is a really high-end card, and another great option from AMD would be the 6700 XT if you didn't need so much grunt, or if you prefer Team Green, something along the lines of an RTX 3060 Ti. With this said, we are doing an all AMD build here, and drivers and software were just really simple. It's just off to the races really. We have a ridiculous amount of GPU power now to play with, as you can see, and the CPU has more than enough grunt to feed the card, particularly when you're cranking up the resolution. I have already reviewed and taken an extensive look at the 6800 XT, including tweaking. I'll leave a few links to our content on this in the video description, including the difference AMD SAM makes to proceeding. But, well, you can see on screen yourself that it's pretty nice. Another nice benefit to all of this is if you want to save power and run a less demanding application or game, let's say an indie game, you can choose for that title to be rendered on the Ryzen 5600G. Overall, the Ryzen 5600G pulls off some impressive victories here, and in lighter gaming workloads makes a very compelling case for itself. Titles such as Counter-Strike is actually, well, very playable. But perhaps the real win is FSR, because while it is awesome for cards like the RX 6800 XT that we were testing earlier, it actually makes an even better case for itself in the low to mid-range segments of the GPU market, and of course this also affects Cezanne. Games such as Resident Evil 8 are very playable with FSR on this system. Now, this is a sponsored video. I want to be very clear about that. I've mentioned it a couple of times already. However, I do think that the 5600G is a very interesting processor, particularly given the price point. It's low £200 at this point, although of course it will depend on your regional equivalent. And from there you get a host of upgrade options. And as for buying a pre-built, well, there are a couple of compelling reasons to do so, although I realise a lot of folks on this channel do prefer the idea of, like, you know, kind of tweaking things yourself. There are some reasons that a pre-built is a great option. The first reason is if the PC is for someone else, like a loved one or a friend, it's great to not be the technical support. Now, I'm sure everyone who watches this channel at some point or another has been that person that everyone starts to call, and it can be kind of exhaustive. At least with this, CyberPower deal with all of the technical questions and complaints and all of that stuff. So that is definitely a great thing. The second reason is if you're kind of short on time, and honestly, again, it is awesome to tweak things, but let's be honest, sometimes you don't really have time to deal with that, especially at certain points in your life. Or, for example, if you want a system for, let's say, your kids, or maybe if you're wanting a system for your home office and you just need something that actually works out of the box, no configurations necessary, it does what it needs to do. And the third reason, and this is perhaps the really big one that I suspect a lot of folks on the channel will be perhaps most interested in, and that is part availability. As I mentioned earlier, shortages have just been absolutely crazy, particularly with GPUs, although they do also affect things like CPUs as well. Ultimately, AMD and other companies are very smart in the fact that they actually do make sure that retailers get hold of GPUs and CPUs, because obviously this is one way to kind of thwart the scalpers. So if you are interested in like a high performance system, then obviously you could buy one from CyberPower or whatever with a high-end GPU. But this is a great building block. I think this system is actually kind of fun to mess around with. And again, it's actually so interesting now what you can get out of an APU in the modern era. I'm actually really interested to see what the future holds for AMD's APUs going forward, especially with the next generation, as we could have a future where we just don't really need a dedicated GPU in the lower performance tiers. Instead, it would just simply be like high performance GPUs for like, 4K gaming and stuff. But yeah, that's perhaps a topic for another video. With that said, thank you again to both AMD and CyberPower for giving me an opportunity to take a look at the system, and also thank you very much for checking out the video. I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.